Hello everyone, I'm Daniel Steele, and I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people here at UBC campus. In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about data justice and health surveillance, and this will cover the bookbinder reading from week 12 of the syllabus. So let's jump right in. So empirical ethics. So just as a bit of a background, the Bookbinder and colleagues article is an example of what's sometimes called empirical bioethics, or just in this case, since it's about public health, empirical public health ethics. And so just the word empirical means having to do with observations and data. So empirical ethics, therefore, combines ethical reasonings, like we've been doing throughout the term, ethical theories, ethical principles, frameworks for, say, public health ethics, or in this case, data justice, with data relevant to the specific case. And the defining feature of empirical ethics is that the researchers themselves are self-consciously combining ethical reasoning with empirical data gathering. In other words, they are not merely themselves just citing other work by other people, say in public health, or on other topics related to health. They aren't just citing other people's data and then doing some ethical reasoning in connection to, say, that data or those examples that they're citing from other people's work, but they're actually gathering that data themselves. And so the idea is that in empirical ethics, one would begin with some ethical problem or question, and then realize that part of answering that is not only sort of thinking about the ethical issues and concepts, but also going and getting some additional data that's relevant to that, and then sort of combining the ethical reasoning and the empirical data to make some recommendation about what to do in the case. So that's what this paper by Bookbinder is doing. I think that's one of the few articles we've read so far that's like this. Almost all of the other articles, they would just tend to simply cite other people's work that would be relevant to whatever public health issues they were talking about. And so the Bookbinder and colleagues reading is specifically concerned with public health surveillance. And according to the Public Health Agency of Canada, surveillance, tracking health events and determinants through the collection, analysis, and reporting of data is the backbone of a strong public health system. I'm sure this is an idea that you have encountered going through the MPH program. So for example, just to take something that's sort of in the news recently, obviously it's very important for public health ministries to keep track of measles cases, how many there are, where they're happening, what are the contact tracing in terms of who is catching the measles from whom and from where and so on. Obviously, this kind of surveillance and for infectious diseases and for many other things is going to be very important. Notice this also talks about determinants, so this could include things like, say, air quality or other determinants of health. So while essential, though, public health surveillance can also raise ethical issues, and that's what the Bookbinder and colleagues article is about. And two types of ethical issues that can be associated with surveillance that are relevant to this reading are harm to people, the risk of harm to people whose data is collected. So the concern is that in some cases, health data that's collected from a certain group of people might be used in ways that are actually not to the benefit of those people. And relatedly, that distrust of health surveillance may cause people to avoid medical care, because of course if you seek out medical treatment or care for a particular health problem, that will involve you being your health data being taken by your physician, and then there might be concerns that data might be used in some ways that aren't beneficial to you. And so if there's distrust, that might cause avoidance of seeking medical care. And these risks are especially acute for members of socially marginalized groups. So here, like Bookbinder and colleagues have in mind, groups of people, for instance, who are, who might be low income, people who are from racialized minorities, people in this example that they discuss who have a health condition that's stigmatized, and also people who have been incarcerated. So the main example that's discussed in the reading is surveillance of HIV, which is obviously, again, an important public health activity, and this analogously to surveillance of measles and other infectious diseases, but it's one that does raise ethical issues noted on the previous slide. So, for example, in the case of HIV, in many places, people can be criminally prosecuted if they're HIV positive and they know their HIV status and have, say, unprotected sex with somebody and don't disclose that status, their HIV status, to their partner. And so while, of course, knowing your HIV status can be very important for accessing treatment, that means the presence of these kinds of laws means that it can expose you to criminal prosecution. So in Canada, there aren't specific laws related to HIV non-disclosure, but there is precedent and a common, sort of well-established precedent for prosecuting non-disclosure of HIV status as sexual assault under Canada's criminal code. So in the US, in the United States, there are a number of states that have laws specifically criminalizing having sex with and being HIV positive and not disclosing your status. In Canada, that essentially exists, but it's not explicitly in the law, but you can be charged for it. Okay, so here's just a link to a report that was about this issue, discussing people's views about this and whether the Canada's criminal code should be reformed on this matter. I'm not going to go into that debate here. The point is really just to raise this background condition as to how it's possible that knowing someone's HIV status or why people might believe that surveillance of HIV might not actually be in their interest, but might be, being done for a kind of punitive reason. Okay, so data justice then is focused, in Bookbinder and colleagues' words, on seeking to address justice concerns for the oppression of vulnerable groups and the structural inequities that shape differential interactions with data. So you can see this bringing in a number of concepts that we've talked about in the term, like social justice, obviously inequities, structural. We talked about that term in relation to structural racism. So, for example, if we're thinking about HIV, due to ongoing and historical racism, HIV is disproportionately affects or has distributed affects Black and Indigenous people in Canada, and so this would be an example of structural racism. If you remember, structural racism was distinguished from individual acts, say, of racial prejudice. Structural racism is tied to things like laws or basic features of how the society is organized. Oftentimes, structural racism will be legacies of past laws, or they can be features of the society like economic inequalities or housing segregation and things like this can be all related to structural racism. And so, of course, that was a topic we discussed earlier in the term. Another concept that we encountered when we discussed social justice and public health was prioritarianism, and this meant a priority on improving the well-being of disadvantaged groups. And this is definitely a theme in the Bookbinder and colleagues article. A third theme that comes up a lot, and that I'll talk about more later in this lecture, is autonomy, specifically in connection with the idea of empowerment of disadvantaged or marginalized groups regarding data surveillance. So this is something we'll talk about a bit more later in the lecture. So, as I mentioned, Bookbinder and colleagues' article is in the style of empirical ethics, and so that means they actually, as part of the study, went out and collected data. So in this case, it was qualitative research, so they were interviewing people, and they interviewed 24 people with HIV in the US state of North Carolina, who were either currently or formerly incarcerated. And in the article, of course you should have read through it for the class, but in the article they discuss what they learned from these interviews, and you can read some of the sort of quotes from particular respondents. Of course, everything is anonymized, so no one's name is included. But here I'll just cover the main themes that were sort of extracted or drawn from these interviews by the researchers. And that is, number one, that structurally vulnerable populations may view public health surveillance as a form of benevolent paternalism. So here the idea is that, contrary to what some have argued in relation to this topic, not everybody in their sample viewed public health surveillance of HIV as this sort of bad thing. In some cases, people had the sense that yes, say a health agency or public health agency is doing this because they're trying to link us up with treatment and things like that. So they had a positive attitude towards it. However, it also raised privacy concerns for some people that they interviewed. Some people really thought, why does the government want to know this stuff? Leave me alone. I don't, if I don't want to give this information, why should I have to? And in addition, if people perceive that this information was taken, that their HIV status was recorded, and so there was some health surveillance going on, but it wasn't linked to any sort of benefits or resources or any sort of healthcare assistance for themselves, this would lead to frustration. It's sort of like, why are you taking this data if you're not going to do anything with it that's helpful to me? And in addition, while there was widespread support for seeking permission and consent for surveillance, there was less agreement about providing it. And this suggests a kind of ethical trade-off here between, on the one hand, making sure people give consent to surveillance, and on the other hand, having comprehensive data, for example, about things like HIV or the measles or other types of infectious diseases. And they draw, Bookbinder and colleagues draw sort of three main lessons from this: that structurally vulnerable groups hold nuanced views on public health surveillance. So it's not that they're either all against it or they're all for it. There's sort of a mixture of different views, and some people have positive views, some people less positive. So the same person might have mixed views about the issue. Secondly, the more people more easily endorse surveillance, that fosters their own self-defined interests. So it's very important to people that the surveillance be seen as benefiting them. Otherwise, people are less likely to be supportive of it, and that there are these individuals might have conflicting views about the subject. And so, based on this, they offer three main recommendations, and I've for each of these recommendations, I've sort of given it a little label that will hopefully make it easier to remember. So the first is that there should be tangible benefits. So here the idea is that public health surveillance should be used to benefit the health of marginalized social groups. So if you're going to be surveilling HIV, that surveillance of HIV should be used, that data should be used in ways that's going to benefit the people who have HIV. And that seems pretty straightforward, but that's a really key thing to emphasize, and in practice it's something that might not always happen. A second theme that was very interesting is that they emphasize separating public health purposes of surveillance from other reasons that surveillance might be done, like law enforcement. In the case of HIV, you can understand, given that there are laws that can criminalize HIV status in relation to things like disclosure to sexual partners, you can understand why it would be important that the public health purposes of surveillance should be distinguished from health surveillance done for other reasons. And finally, empowerment, which I had mentioned above, that members of marginalized communities affected by public health surveillance should be empowered, and this is a quote, to participate in the design and implementation of data infrastructure and governance. Now, Bookbinder and colleagues do discuss some challenges that can arise for some of these recommendations. In particular, they talk about challenges that might arise from empowerment. They point out that it's not always the case that a marginalized group of people is sort of cohesive or organized. It might be you've got, say, the people who have HIV in a particular geographical region aren't organized into any kind of advocacy group, and they might not have a whole lot in common with one another aside from having HIV. And in that kind of case, that might mean that some community building or activism or organization needs to happen before the sort of group empowerment at a group level can really get going, but that would be sort of part of this process. They don't discuss challenges for the second recommendation about separating public health surveillance from other purposes that surveillance might have, like law enforcement, but I think that could also be a challenge as well. So if you think about the group of people that they were interviewing, these were all folks who had been incarcerated or were currently incarcerated, and it's clear that being tested for HIV as part of being incarcerated is really difficult to separate from law enforcement. It's really going to be difficult to separate being tested for HIV while you're in jail or in prison from being subject to law enforcement. And so in practice, separating the public health purposes of surveillance from other purposes of surveillance isn't necessarily always going to be easy, but you can see the idea or the reason as to why that would be an important thing to do, because one of the key ideas is to communicate to populations that the surveillance isn't being done in a punitive way, but is being done to improve people's health. improve the health of people whose data is being taken. Okay, so that's it for this lecture.